Hi, everyone, and welcome to this next episode of the Sustainable Connections podcast. I'm Mark Lee, the Global Director of Thought Leadership at ERM, your regular host. If you're back listening to us again, thank you so much. If you're a new listener, then really welcome. And you picked a great episode to pick up on as well. This conversation is going to be about London Climate Action Week. It's just taken place. The conditions were, well, they were terrible. It was the middle of a record-breaking heat wave in the UK and in Europe more broadly. It absolutely disrupted infrastructure. And there was the terrible irony, of course, that London Climate Action Week events were changed, canceled, delayed. People missed them because of trains and planes and logistics. But the event went forward with at least 75,000 people. Some of the estimates are now ranging up to 100,000 people. If you don't know the backstory, London Climate Action Week only launched in 2019. It nearly doubled in size this year, depending on where that high number was. So truly rivaling New York Climate Week as the biggest annual climate event on the planet. And I took that as really encouraging, actually, that at a time when it feels like there's a lot of backlash and challenge in the sustainability field broadly, and at least varying momentum on the climate agenda, London Climate Action Week reminded us how many people think this agenda is essential and are trying to do something about it. There was a huge range of themes. We can't cover all of them today. ERM had a team on the ground there, and of course, we couldn't cover all of them in person either. But we got quite plugged in on topics like just transition and electrification and supply chains and sustainable products. And I'm here today with three of my colleagues from ERM who were on the ground in London. And we're going to collectively break the story down a little bit for you and give you at least some insights into what happened in the UK last week. So I've got Irem Yerdelen, who's our partner in charge for London Climate Action Week and our lead for corporate sustainability and climate change in the UK. Anna Jakobsen is our lead in Europe, the Middle East and Africa for social impact and human rights. And finally, Jason Smith is our lead in Europe, Middle East, Africa for sustainable product and supply chain. And so welcome all three of you, and thanks for your time here. And honestly, I just want to get a personal perspective first, partly to hear your voices and partly just to hear a highlight, like what stood out for you from the incredible diversity of things that happened last week. And Irem, maybe you can come in and kick us off in the conversation. Give us a highlight or an insight from last week that's still lodged in your mind.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark, for inviting me to this podcast. It's a pleasure. And also it was incredible honor and privilege to be the partner in charge for ERM's efforts for this year. So I can only tell you that the most powerful thing was to see the sheer number of people everywhere, despite the heat wave and disruptions that you mentioned, coming from over 100 different countries, leaders from business, finance, policy, technology. They were all there and they were all hungry to explore the partnerships and innovation needed to accelerate the transition to a net zero economy. And for years, as you know, the focus was on ambition, commitments, targets. And this year in particular, the conversation was much more about the delivery.
And it's
London,
time, right?
Yes, absolutely. And London, again, put itself on the map, being the center stage for all these discussions, because, again, the convening power of the city was incredible. And a personal highlight, perhaps, was to see our clients appreciate it so much for the roundtable style events that ERM hosted, because to be able to have candid conversations and to deep dive into that expert advice there and then. And I think when you go to very large events, that might not be possible. So we got a lot of compliments about that.
Yeah, I think you put your finger on what I've found to be the trick at other COPs and Climate Week kind of events, that there's so much power in the numbers. It's amazing and it's inspiring to see that many thousand people come together, and people get a little lost. And that roundtable format of giving people almost a safe place, an anchor, a home in the midst of the madness is where really interesting conversations have the opportunity to come forward. Anna, did you have a similar experience or different take on the week as a whole?
Some similarities, some differences, I guess, and echoing Irem, thank you so much for having me, Mark. It's a real pleasure to join. I think a key standout for me was sort of the sheer energy and ambition. The program was so incredibly rich. It was actually hard to select which ones to attend outside of our own events, of course. And I think what was clear is also that London is increasingly seen as this sort of global hub for climate debate and action, so very much rivaling New York. And as you mentioned, the week was sort of set to be the largest yet, even with a few cancellations due to the heat. But I think for me, across the sessions, one common thread that I noted was around that implementation point. And Irem also mentioned that, whether that be in climate finance, when we talked about energy security or just transition, that we all need and want to see, and companies need to show real, tangible economic and community returns, and not just the ambition.
Okay, when we get deeper in our conversation, I'm going to probe, of course, on whether we got evidence of that implementation, because both you and Irem mentioned it. But Jason, first, I want to hear just a 30,000-foot take from you, and I dare you to say anything but, that what your two colleagues have already mapped out.
No, definitely. And thanks, Mark. Thanks for the invite on this. Look, I suppose adding to those points, what I saw was a huge amount of energy. And I think the point that people mentioned around implementation, I completely agree with that, but it was real action. What I saw from the clients that I was speaking to was, they were working with imperfect data and imperfect information, but actually still wanting to progress and go that directional way. So we are seeing that real drive for change now. And the other big thing that stood out for me was our clients are now starting to think more about the wider system. They're collaborating with each other. We're seeing many of them come together. And also, some of that is down to the way they're backed financially to support these programs, the institutions and how they lend and borrow money to lean into these ecosystems. So for me, it was real sense of wider collaboration, system thinking, and driving implementation. And all those things for me were super encouraging. It shows that we're getting behind some of this and we're really starting to see the change and manage that change.
Yeah, heat aside, it sounds like all of you got a real charge of optimism even from your attendance there this week, and I want to hear more. So I'm going to go a little bit more topic specific now. And Anna, if it's okay, I'd like to start with you. The topic I want to pull onto the table is the just transition. And, I think it's fair to say just transition has had an uneven ride over recent years, and even as a concept within the climate debate. Sometimes we get very focused on the quantitative environmental and the technological, and we just want to solve the problem. And it's not always easy to get people into the center of the conversation. I think it's essential. I think ERM thinks it's essential. And we hosted a session there. We've done some research recently with the WBCSD, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, on this topic. And with them, we've been trying to advance it and push it forward. So if we take what you said about London Climate Action Week trying to move from principles, and I think the principles of the just transition are quite fully embraced, but the implementation part is hard. What did you see happening to give us evidence that that's actually moving forward?
And I think maybe also worth noting that this session that we hosted together with the WBCSD followed a few that we did last year to launch our Business Leaders Guide for a Just Climate Transition. So some of the listeners might be interested to take a look at that. But if we focus very much on that the practical actions and tools, and I'll touch on a few things that sort of stood out to me from the discussion and the event, is that just transition is much more effective when it's embedded into existing business processes and when teams are set up to collaborate. So you can't run it as a separate sort of work stream over here. It needs to be very central to the way that you run and engage. And we saw some of the strongest examples companies in the room mentioned was linking it to governance and oversight, to procurement, to HR, to risk, to their investment decisions, and also community engagement rather than treating it as a standalone topic. What also became quite clear is that a lot of companies are already doing just transition in some shape or form, but they may not call it that. So there's a few sort of different phrases, I guess, being thrown around. But common in terms of upskilling or reskilling, that sort of local supplier development, community investment, benefit sharing, and also human rights due diligence, they're often already underway, but they might not be connected under sort of a shared strategy or a shared sort of label umbrella, if you will. Another thing that came through was the business case, that social factors very much affect the transition speed, the cost, and also the resilience. So examples that companies gave was around talent retention, supply chain resilience, and I suspect we'll hear from Jason more on that one, regulatory readiness, but also market access. And also quite a few spoke about the value of early community engagement to then avoid later delays, opposition, which can be very, very costly financially and reputationally.
Yes, so often that is what stops projects from going ahead, right? It's not the technical and it's not the skill, it's whether society has accepted this.
Yeah, and whether companies are engaged early enough and thoroughly enough. But you mentioned implementation. So I think what came through as well, it's highly company and context specific. So it's hard to sort of be generalist, but there was a few different perspectives shared. So one of the companies in the room shared how just transition is being embedded through governance and investment decision, even when they didn't have sort of a formal roadmap or strategy set out. So they mentioned the use of an ESG investment tool to assess new projects across climate, human rights, social and environmental dimensions. And then they had some identified gaps tracked, and there was sort of a follow-up process and verification set up. So I thought that was quite interesting.
Yeah, if I can, and I think given the investment focus there, and Irem, that's sort of your world often. And when we see something moving from concept to practice in the corporate space, generally we start to find a money trail. And so Anna's telling us there's at least one company in the room there sort of relating the case on their investment decisions. But is that spreading more broadly? Do you see that in your portfolio? Do you see it across industries? Is this gathering momentum at this time?
Yes, certainly. And I think I would like to see more of that, to be honest. What I can say on this is investors are recognizing that the success of the low carbon transition depends not only the technological and financial viability, but also how the transition affects workers, communities, customers, and to a degree supply chains. And that's why we have Jason here today. So I think as a result, just transition factors are increasingly influencing risk assessment and capital allocation. So, I mean, this is obviously encouraging because investors treat climate and social issues now much more interconnected. And investors, not only themselves, but alongside insurers, they need better ways to distinguish credible transition from aspiration. So they see social outcomes as a determinant of transition success. So for me, this is an opportunity for our clients and organizations to position just transition, not as a standalone social initiative, but as a critical component of credibility, how to get the capital, and also increasing long-term enterprise value. And I know, I'm sure Anna can add to it as well, but most of ERM clients that we work on take consideration on this basis. And basically, they invest into things like workforce reskilling instead of asset closure, selecting industrial decline locations for their new manufacturing facilities, investing in supplier transition rather than replacing the suppliers. So there's a lot of additional project CapEx and OpEx directed towards community programs to make sure that local employment influence contractor selection. So I think these are good examples, and definitely we can see that more happening in this implementation era.
Good news. And Anna, if I loop back on that, part of it is it seems like there's such a range of possible ways for companies to engage the just transition and make it part of their work. And so when you're starting with folks, are there a few practical steps that create the best foundation to do this? Where should people start?
Yeah, and it's interesting. I think there's a strong demand out there for sort of practical tools and metrics. So what are those approaches that can help companies sort of map out interconnections, for example, between climate, nature, and social, and make those trade-offs visible from the outset and build in? And there was a company in the room that gave an example of having sort of a budget line item to make it really tangible in terms of when you make financial decision making. But I just wanted to add another thing to what Irem was saying, because I think also we talked a lot about sort of what the company remit, but what was also really flagged in our session was that collaboration beyond the company boundary as being really essential. Just transition can't be delivered by sort of individual companies alone working in silos. If we're going to have real progress, you need coalitions across business, across government, investors, and sort of local stakeholders.
And in some ways, that's partly what we're trying to do in the work with WBCSD, and that there's a coalition of companies and other partners trying to figure this out collectively, right? And we'll definitely in the notes that go with posting this podcast, we can include a link to the Leader's Guide on Just Transition that you mentioned before, so that we can point people to that and other resources.
Well, if you wanted me to build on the sort of practical steps, because I think, and I mentioned it just in passing, but that mapping of climate, nature, social interconnections to really understand what are those interlinkages, what are the possible trade-offs, what are some of the nexus points and then choke points, if you will, between those domains. They are absolutely key to understanding sustainability in operational terms. So we need to look at it as resilience, not a sort of checklist when you do that mapping.
Perfect. No, and I know we could do easily a whole episode on just transition, and we probably should loop back and just dig deeper on the topic. But Jason, we've been pointing at you, but just keeping you at arm's length in the conversation so far. It's more than time to bring you in, and we'll shift gears a little bit, right? So in your intro and in your colleagues' comments, we've been pointing at your supply chain expertise. And this is another way in which coalitions are required, right? That companies are not going to be able to deal with their impacts, climate and otherwise, especially scope 3, unless they're working up and down their value chains. And It's so much easier to say that than do that. But the urgency of getting the scope 3 part pinned down couldn't be clearer as we plow past 1.5 degrees Celsius, and kind of just wonder at this point how far we're going to go past before we have a chance to get back. So I hope you're going to be able to tell me that companies are beginning to engage suppliers differently and more deeply. But what in fact are you seeing? How is the scope 3 challenge playing out in real time?
Definitely, Mark. And look at a lot of the comments that were mentioned earlier. Hopefully I can bring to life what we're seeing with our clients in those supply chains, but also some good experience of the clients and discussions we got into at London Climate Week, because we are seeing companies shift from that whole compliance and data collection into that mindset of really enablement and investment. So, some of the things that we discussed earlier in the call, we're seeing those changes through the value chain. We are seeing our clients move from, annual surveys to go into digital platforms and partnering with those organizations. So we led a session with Sakara and AstraZeneca, where we talked about the impact that they could have through their value chain, engaging 500 different suppliers. Lots of practical things around the tiered expectations. So they've got some suppliers that are super mature in certain areas, and they're really driving those to help them support the targets, but also engaging those less developed suppliers to help them think through, if they're not fully on board with scope 3, how they manage their scope 2, and then build that into the extended value chain. So, that's great. We're also seeing, I suppose, the discussions that procurement are having around tying carbon into their procurement decisions and making sure that whole ecosystem is kind of singing the same song and moving along together. And we're also, to the point that Anna mentioned earlier, we're seeing those financial incentives being built in the supply chain. So, there's reward for those clients for those suppliers, that are demonstrating their ability to start to move towards decarbonization. And as I mentioned at the outset, they're not all chasing perfect data anymore. It's about directional data that can actually drive some action. So the encouraging thing for me is we're seeing change. I mentioned AZ ran one of the sessions with us, but we've also got, growing out that ecosystem. We're working with organizations like Appella, like Sanofi, where we're bringing thousands of suppliers in on issues like heat decarbonization and giving them real practical steps as to how they can decarbonize, what that would mean to their business, how it supports their growth, how it means that they can build into other bigger clients. So the encouraging thing for me, Mark, is we're definitely seeing the action. We're seeing that investment push down the value chain, but it's practical steps. And that's the great thing for me is, we're moving in the right direction. And these are global businesses that are not just looking to do this in particular geographies. This is their entire value chain. So super encouraging.
Yeah. And Jason, you mentioned in there the financial incentives. And can you talk a little bit about what those look like and whether you think they'll persist? Because I think we've seen premiums attempted in various industries over time, right? For low carbon steel, for responsibly sourced coffee. And the experience seems to be that you can offer that for a limited period, but then it has to be you deliver the higher standard product at the same price. So what does that look like for Scope 3?
So, I mean, in the example I mentioned earlier, that's where they're offering additional work to those clients that are demonstrating that they are, that they're putting these measures in place. So it's a bigger share of the pie in many cases of the current. So there's volume, but also, what we are seeing from some of our clients, and in particular in consumer markets, is we're now seeing growing demand for more sustainable products. So it's being part of that growth as well as getting a bigger portion of the pie.
Yeah, I want to add something actually to Jason's point and also bringing Anna's just transition comments earlier. So what we saw during all these interactions is companies that demonstrate a credible pathway to decarbonization while protecting workers, communities, and supply chains are actually being viewed as a lower risk profile. So therefore, they become more investable and better positioned for long-term value creation for their organization. So this was very loud and clear in our partnership discussion as well.
Yeah, and that more investable, I just hear being echoed across different conversations. Anna, this is pointed back to you in a couple of ways again as well, that as we try and manage an energy transition all the way across supply chains, of course, we keep bumping into workers and communities. And so as we make the kinds of progress that Jason and Irem just described, how are workers and communities being taken into account as we push forward on Scope 3 and other supply chain challenges?
Well, I think at least organizations are increasingly recognizing that the transition is not only a climate challenge, but also a human rights, a workforce, as you mentioned, a community challenge. So I think the focus has shifted from maybe being more like a simply sort of let's create green jobs to ensuring that we have a just transition that manages those impacts on workers, suppliers, indigenous peoples and host communities, while also then maximizing the social benefits. I think that's a really positive development. I think in terms of workers, the focus is on minimizing impacts from things like job displacement, investing in workforce, reskilling needs, also addressing risks of poor working conditions, migrant worker exploitation, forced labor, unsafe work if you're a new supply chain that you need to get sort of transparency around. And I think with regards to community, some of the key concerns we see our clients grapple with is that sort of economic dependence on perhaps a declining industry and what your role and accountability is within that, community impacts from closures or asset retirements, and also increasingly in some locations we're seeing that question of equitable distribution of economic benefits from transition projects being a real issue that communities are very, very passionate about, and also local governments. And I think there's a lot of learnings that can be gained from extractive industry companies. They've been working on these issues for a long time. But I think there's some core elements of good practice that sort of shine through in our engagement with various companies on this topic. I think one is you need to start planning early. So, no reactive responses. You need to have long-term transition planning and assessing impacts and then engaging around those from the outset and a continuous engagement. And also apply a human right due diligence across energy transition supply chains, because I think good practice extend beyond direct employees and communities to also contractors and suppliers. And I think this also aligns with growing expectations on the things like the UN Guiding Principles, the OECD guidelines, and here in the EU, the CSDDD. And I think actually a last point that I'll make before handing over is around measuring social outcomes, not just climate outcomes. So we see organizations increasingly tracking things like, what are jobs created and lost? What worker satisfaction looking like? What's the community well-being? And also inclusion of vulnerable groups. So I think that reflects a sort of broader recognition that a successful energy transition needs to deliver both against environmental objectives, but also deliver that sort of social value.
Yeah, and that kind of measurement and bringing forward that evidence is so essential, right? To convincing people in communities that investment in climate transition is worthwhile and that they can have a better quality of life on the other side.
Exactly, and credible around the actions you're taking and the outcomes you want to deliver. Yeah.
Irem, I'm going to come back to you and still supply chain, different angle again. And I think for a good while, there's been a mantra of kind of like electrify everything. And it's another easier said than done kind of piece. But there was a re-emphasis on this, I think, in London Climate Action Week. A coalition of more than 100 companies called on governments to make it an economic priority. Clearly, if we're going to reduce carbon in supply chains, we need to be able to increase electrification. What is stopping us? What are the obstacles? What are the opportunities to move this forward?
Yeah, great question, Mark. Well, perhaps maybe let me give you a context around what happened in London Climate Action Week. Was one of the first meetings, COP31 presidency came out and basically declared a key target regarding the role of electrification. So that was a quite cool moment. And that was basically 35 by 35. So 35% of global final energy consumption to be met by electricity by 2035. And this is basically up from just over 20% today. So I think it is achievable. And the expectation is 90% will come from the corporate transition to electrification. And I think that basically accelerates the electrification across transport, buildings, industry, households. So there's a lot to be done. And basically, the presidency positioned electrification as not just a climate solution, but also an energy affordability and an energy security measure. So given all the energy crisis in the world due to various challenges, geopolitical issues, everybody got that. So this is now a great place to build on. And although electrification sounds cool, but it has got its limits. And I mean, it's accelerating for sure, driven by both cost and security concerns. However, not all industrial heat demand can be electrified with the current technology. And also grid expansion and associated costs are major constraints still for, data centers and so on. So therefore, one of the key considerations is that cost of delivered electricity, including network charges, is as important as the generation cost itself. So with that kind of background, ERM hosted an industrial and buildings energy roundtable. And basically, we took the discussion to such a pragmatic view, and perhaps the opportunities that I could highlight. I mean, with energy efficiency, plus on-site energy creation and selective electrification, our clients and organizations in general can address cost resilience and emission reduction all simultaneously. I think this is a great place to be and to basically put money towards. However, I think the challenge is delivery at scale is constrained, like I said, by technology, also the system's complexity and some institutional barriers, infrastructure readiness. So now I think that whole call to government is requiring a lot more public-private collaboration to actually now see the scale of movement in that area.
Yeah, and the 35 by 35, I thought was one of the exciting announcements out of London last week. And you gave us the numbers, but I want to repeat them. That 20% today, 35% in 2035. Attainable for sure, but 9 years and almost double. And I don't want anyone to underestimate the scale of effort that's going to be required to drive that essential piece forward. Jason, I want to shift gears again. And, we have this massive event, incredibly broad topic, really a myriad set of topics. And sometimes it helps to break it down. And in the midst of all this, one of the sessions you led, I think, was on sustainable packaging. So we're getting down to really specific topic, really precise. And I think often people have seen it as a compliance issue. They've used the materials that they've been allowed to. And now we're seeing a shift to how can sustainable packaging really drive action on climate and carbon reduction, but also how can it be a broader value creation lever? So what evidence did you find for that in the session that you led?
Yeah, no, thanks, Mark. And look, 3 years ago, I don't think the packaging discussion was too much in vogue. I've been fascinated over the last couple of years at the number of discussions we've got into. If you think about packaging, the external regulatory reporting requirements are now complex and they're evolving. And what's interesting for me is packaging's kind of no longer seen as a delivery mechanism for a number of our clients. It's a bit more of a gateway to their brand experience, and they're really focused in on this. And we've got legislation at the moment like PPWR, which focuses on things like hazardous substances, recycled content, minimization, core elements that actually, if you don't comply with those or get them right, you get limited market access. So you cannot be supplying your product into the EU or to individual countries. So all at once, this has risen right up to a C-suite agenda because it's stopping the growth within those businesses. Now, what's great is we're helping those clients through the compliance journey, but actually, because of the requirements of PPWR, we're really getting into the interesting side that says, what's your consumer insight that's going to go drive growth in your products? How can we redesign your packaging format so that they comply with the legislation, but also create an amazing brand experience? And the great thing is we are working with, I suppose, both sides. We've got designers within the team that are looking at those new concepts, those new designs in more sustainable ways, using the recycled material, using less material, helping those clients comply, but also supporting them through the kind of digital journey that they're going along with this. Because, PPWR is running out over the next 5 years. There's so many different things that they need to report and change. And it's helping them comply with that, but creating really exciting products. So good examples of that, we're working with organizations like Bayer, where in their consumer health group, we're helping them think through the entirety of their product range, how they can reimagine that packaging based on the incoming legislation. So we're building an engine that actually takes that consumer insight around their products in each of their markets, but also the incoming legislation, and marrying those two together and actually helping them create, really exciting packaging formats, ones that can grow in the market. We had one of our speakers, James Pryor, who's the CEO of Touch Design, speak at the event. And he also spoke about, 2 or 3 formats that they've helped clients with, one of which was WD-40, which was, it was an application pen rather than a spray can, but actually saved 700% of the product because most of the product, when you spray it, just hits the floor. So, real stuff that from a sustainability perspective is driving change. It's driving increased margin for those businesses that are making it. And the same again with, there's formats like Purina in the cat food side. I think we also discussed a Vicks Vapor Rub, which was also a roll-on applicator. So really thinking through not just how do we comply with PPWR, but how do we drive innovation in that whole design process and really grow the market share for those clients. So it's definitely moved on. In my view, packaging's kind of the new rock and roll at the moment. It's probably about 40% of what I do. So really excited by it, but lots and lots to go for.
We could not have a better advocate for the sustainable packaging community, Jason. I love that it's the new rock and roll. But in all seriousness, I'm with you that sustainability and climate work in a corporate context, especially when they make products better, right? Not when they just meet a standard, not when they just kind of tick a box. So incredibly important and terrific to hear those examples. And I want to check again, the people part. So what role does social issues play in sustainable packaging decisions? Maybe it's the sourcing, maybe it's, you tell me.
Yeah, I think the social dimension is often overlooked because I think discussions do tend to focus on environmental impacts, so whether that's recyclability or waste reduction or common footprint. But I think as we're seeing, and also some of the clients that Jason mentioned, considering impacts on people throughout the value chain, from raw material sourcing through end-of-life management, is really, really key. And we see sort of good practice really integrating considerations for human rights, for worker well-being, community development, consumer accessibility as well, and sort of livelihoods coming from circular economy, taking that into account alongside the more traditional environmental objectives. I think another thing we're seeing increasing sort of consideration placed on is it accessible and inclusive consumers? So examples would include sort of clear labeling, easy to open designs, accessible disposal instructions, and also does it create value for local communities? So packaging choices can influence local economies and communities, and we see companies having policies around, local sourcing and procurement, supporting small and medium enterprises, job creation in those sort of recycling, reuse, collection systems, and also community engagement around that sort of waste management initiative. So I think there are plenty of social dimensions, and I'm glad you asked the questions because it doesn't always come up. Sometimes the focus is more on the environment side, but I think there's lots of interconnect.
Yeah. And it's always embedded there, right? It's always there somewhere. Irem, I think it's safe to say the financial aspect is always there as well. And all of you have referenced alongside the kind of push towards implementation, the business case efforts that are going on in the field right now. And does sustainable packaging playing a role there as well? Are we seeing it in dollars and cents or pounds and pence, if you choose?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, for me, it is a classic sustainability business case because sustainable packaging often delivers environmental benefits while simultaneously reducing operating expenditure. And Jason already gave these examples, but, eliminating unnecessary materials, lightweight packaging, improving the precision packaging. I think these are very innovative. And in most of our client examples, the examples include investment in precision packaging technology and purely to lower costs. And also, I think the packaging decisions directly influence compliance costs. We discussed that as well, because future liabilities, regulatory preparedness, these are all additional costs. So we can't just think about it as a material thing. I think for me, this is a great example of how sustainability is moving from an environmental initiative to business decision. And if you do it well, sustainable packaging strengthens brands, reputation, reduction of cost, and also supply chain resilience. So we are really making sure that the clients that we work with creating the most value by utilizing this opportunity for themselves.
And great to hear those topics were in play, Irem. I'm also wondering, you've been at multiple past climate weeks and like events, and how present was the investor and finance community this time? Did they show in force, and were they there to hear these stories directly, or do we still need to get the message to them after the event?
No, actually, they were very present. In fact, I think given the heat wave, mostly discussed topic was adaptation and climate resilience from a physical aspect, but also finance community was very present when it comes to holistic integration of issues like insurability, resilience of supply chains, energy security, as well as water and nature security. So they're basically trying to utilize their money also harder when it comes to allocating it to transition finance versus climate finance versus emerging economies. So definitely they are all up for implementation and all up for utilizing whatever guideline is out there to really channel the money to the right places.
Excellent. Good to hear that they were there, and it sounds like they're starting to take those right and necessary steps. Well, hey, the time we've had together has gone by pretty quickly. I do want to ask you both to help me predict the future here before we wrap up. So just a couple more questions for Jason and Irem. And that's looking ahead. London Climate Action Week in some ways almost kicks off a season of climate-related events that will go through New York Climate Week and then through this year's COP31 as well. And if a theme here has been the shift towards implementation, tangible progress, business case, Jason, how do you hope the supply chain story carries forward the rest of 2026 so we see ourselves in a significantly better place in terms of supply chain action at the start of 2027?
It's a really good question. And look, I think what we need to do is continue and grow with the momentum. And the reason I'm encouraged, I suppose, coming out of London Climate Week and also speaking to clients and some of our technology partners is we're forging alliances with technology companies. So if I speak about decarbonization, which was the first topic in the supply chain, we're working with technology firms like Sakara and Carbme and actually bringing in founding partners that are looking at system-wide decarbonization. So people like Appella, AZ, Sanofi have come together with their supply chains. So we're now taking through thousands of suppliers on this heat decarbonization journey. And this is supporting learning through all of that ecosystem as well. So it's not just, for the benefit of one. This is genuinely driving that change through those value chains. We're getting new founding members, Mark, every month. as part of this coalition. So my sense is that, people want to be part of this. It's now seen as a really both positive from, not just your sustainability objectives, but positive in terms of your future growth. So we're really starting to see the kind of bigger corporate organizations start to galvanize their supply chains around this area and invest in it. So for me, that's really encouraging. We're getting more founding members. The list of others that we know want to join is phenomenal, huge organizations. So I think that momentum will continue right through, as you said, through New York and the next COP. So for me, encouraged because we're creating a community of people that actually want to manage this change, and they're pushing this through their value chains. And it's important, the other great thing about Climate Week is we spent time with those clients over dinner in the evenings having chat. And actually, they're passionate about this. It is going to happen. And that for me was, that's it's exciting for us all to work together on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And that shift is so powerful from supply chain requirement, to supply chain benefit, to an invitation instead of an obligation, and seeing people seize that and really want to be part of what's happening instead of wondering how they can minimize that kind of activity. It's powerful, powerful stuff. Irem, how about for you as you look ahead at the rest of the year into these other upcoming events? What do you expect?
Well, I think this London Climate Action Week really paved the way for a successful COP. And besides the themes that we covered today, also there were a lot of chatter around waste management, food systems, methane, and more other topics to tackle. I think for me, what stood out is nailing these topics, the 3 topics that we mentioned for sure, and also about climate cooperation despite geopolitical fragmentation. So climate action is now seen as a collective thing. I mean, has always been like that, but I think now around delivering scalable solutions and implementation wise, it is all very much around competitiveness and growth and right investment strategies. So that's why for our clients and our community partners, etc., it's all about sort of demonstrating credible delivery pathways that link decarbonization, resilience, nature, social, and basically create outcomes for long-term business value. So that is, to me, the backbone of everything. And if I had to summarize the mood sort of heading into COP31 in one sentence, I would say the climate agenda is maturing from ambition to execution, with finance, resilience becoming the key themes through which success will be judged.
Well, we'll watch for all those things that are beginning to weave together to link more tightly as the field continues to mature. And I think we're at that point now where I just need to say thanks so much to all 3 of you for joining today and sharing your insights and your experience from London this year. And thanks to all of our listeners as well for sticking with us through the conversation. If you enjoyed Sustainable Connections today or otherwise, you can find all the episodes on your platform of choice, be that Apple or Google or Spotify or other. All the episodes are also on erm.com. If you have any feedback for us, we would always love to hear it. So with that, thanks to our listeners and thanks again to today's speakers. Good luck for everyone with the rest of summer in the northern climate as we move from heat waves in Europe to heat waves in North America. So it's this continent's turn this time around, but we've all got tangible evidence of the work that remains to be done. Bye for now.